Hello, global gardeners. It's Monday. It's time to talk gardening. Great to have you all here today. Shout out, of course, to Jay and Heidi, who are fantastic facilitators and moderators and helping us move along today. It's so great to see you all here. It's actually snowing for me in Colorado right now. It started about half an hour ago. It's coming down quite hard, and the dogs have been enjoying being outside. So I'm sure we'll go out and play in the snow a little bit when we're done here today. It's definitely not a gardening day, though I'll probably do some filming. Today on the show, we're going to be talking about plant genetics. How often have you thought about the genetics of what you're growing in the garden? I'm guessing probably not enough. And so there'll be a little bit of science, of course, when we talk about the genetics, but I'm really hoping to give you some practical information to help you determine what you should be growing in your garden to get the best success and to have the plants grow to their maximum potential. Let's go ahead and start with a question from Brent. I watched the raised bed video. I was wondering if anyone knows if there is an advantage or disadvantage to using more boards or less, i.e., 3 2x4s or 1 2x12. So there is a difference. The first is the size. When we talk about a 2x4 or a 2x12, that's a nominal size. Subtract half an inch from that. So if you're using 3 2x4s, you're not going to get a 12-inch span. You're going to get 3.5-inch spans. So you're only getting 10.5 inches of depth if you're using 3 2x4s. Whereas the 2x12 still has that missing half inch, but it's only 1/2 inch. So a board that's 2x12 will give you an 11.5-inch bed. So there's a 1-inch difference in the size. That's probably the biggest difference. As far as advantages and disadvantages, you have to look at the cost. Typically, the wider boards will cost more than the narrower boards. So if you can get 3 2x4s at less cost than 1 2x12, sure, consider that as an option. I don't go any less than 2x6s, which is 5.5. So to get a 12-inch bed, I use 2x6s, and it really ends up being 11 inches, but that's close enough to 12 inches for me. And the reason that's the smallest I go is another possible disadvantage. The higher the bed, the more likely the boards are going to bow from the weight and the volume of the soil that's in that bed. And so if you had nothing but 2x4s and they're spanning an 8-foot distance of the bed, they're more likely to bow in the middle than a single 2x12, which is going to be sturdier. So that's one of those things that I look at is the stability of the bed, the sturdiness of the bed, and those thicker boards definitely make a difference for that. And then the third thing I'll throw at you that I've noticed in my garden when I've used 2x4s, the boards are going to break down in time and they're going to decay. If you live in a wet region, if you keep the soil in the bed moist all the time, the boards are going to start breaking down. Well, there's a lot more surface area on the edges of that 2x4, and that's where it's going to break down first. So with 3 2x4s, you're going to have all of the sides begin to break down and decay, whereas in a single 2x12, you've only got the 4 sides. So the bigger boards tend to last longer. They don't break down as quickly, and that could be a consideration. It might be cheaper to do some of those smaller boards, but they're probably going to need replacement sooner than some of the others. So hope that helps, some considerations. I love my raised beds, and I think if you have a material and you can use it to make a bed, go ahead and use it. Regardless of what it is, it can really give you an advantage by building out your garden and giving you some beds that you might not otherwise have. So thank you for that question. Gardens Happen says, I would suggest metal beds. Corrugated metal roofing works well. And I agree with that. The metal tends to last longer than the wood. I've made videos about this. I have a video that shows how I made my corrugated metal beds. I also have videos that show how I made my metal beds using the kits that you can get all the pieces pre-cut ready to go. And so you could check out some of those videos as an option that is not wood to go with metal. The metal tends to be more expensive up front for the most part, but it generally lasts longer. So take that into consideration as you're putting your beds together as well. So Sean says, I love my corrugated beds. I expect they should last quite a while. The one caveat about the galvanized steel corrugated metal beds is that if you live in a region with very acidic soil, the low pH, that acid in the soil, will cause the corrugation to break down a little bit faster than those of us that might live in a region with alkaline soil. So my metal has shown very little degradation, but I know people that live in high acid, low pH regions, and again, the edges will tend to break down a little bit faster in those kind of regions. So something to think about. And Owen says retaining blocks are an almost forever bed. And absolutely, I have my concrete block beds. I've got a video on that as well, of course, and that is definitely an option to consider. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin talking about the idea behind the genetics of a bed, or not of a bed, of the plants that we're putting into our beds. When we talk about genetics for animals, if we're talking about animal breeding, we take the chromosomes that mix from a male and a female, and then the offspring is whatever it is we're trying to breed. So you can see this very obviously in dogs. The many different breeds of dogs that have been developed over the last 100 years. It's all about mixing the genetics between the father and the mother to get the chromosome mix, to get whatever attribute that you're trying to get from that animal that you're breeding. There are similarities to that in the plant world. The idea being that you take one plant and you pollinate with another plant, and the offspring is something that we're trying to breed. That's cross-pollination. When we're taking pollen from one plant and using it to breed with a different type of plant, and it produces a hybrid. Hybrids have been developed for many different reasons, for taste, for disease resistance, for color. That's all part of the plant breeding, mixing the chromosomes within the plants. But, and this is unique to plants when we compare it to animal breeding or even hybrid breeding, many plants have the ability to self-pollinate. They don't need a different type of plant to be able to propagate and produce offspring. So when we talk about the open pollinated varieties, the heirloom plants, many of those will be a consistent genetic result. And many of those are self-pollinating. So tomatoes, for instance, have a perfect flower where they can pollinate themselves. Excuse me, had to sneeze there for a minute. And so when we have a tomato plant, like my favorite black krim, I can grow the black krim and save the seeds for the black krim and expect that when I plant those seeds, I will have another black krim tomato because those flowers pollinated themselves. And that's what enabled the genetics of the black krim to stay the same from one generation to the next. You'll see that in peppers. You'll see that in beans. There are a number of the plants we're growing in our garden that we don't need another plant to produce seed. And we certainly don't need a different type of plant to produce seed. Let's counter that with something like an apple. Apple trees do require a completely different individual tree to be able to produce the apples and the seeds. So if you've tried growing a single apple tree, you might get some flowers and you might get some fruit, but you're not going to get a substantial harvest unless you have a second apple tree so that those trees can cross pollinate with each other. A single tree, one of the reasons that you might get some fruit is because you might have a neighbor with a crab apple tree, or you might have somebody that lives a half a mile away that has an apple tree, and the pollinators are flying back and forth. That apple tree, with few exceptions, is not going to be able to pollinate itself. That's why if you plant an apple seed, you never know what kind of tree you're going to get, because every apple that is produced is a hybrid from a cross-pollinated variety that was growing nearby. And you may say, but how about Red Delicious? I grow a Red Delicious apple tree or a Gala apple tree, and I always get that same type of apple, regardless of what's happening around it. Well, now we get into a whole nother region of the genetics. So when we have cross-pollination between apple trees, between squash plants, whatever it is you're growing, the pollen is necessary for that fruit to develop, the pollen from the other plant. The fruit that develops is determined by the genetics of the parent plant. So if you're growing a zucchini and you have a yellow squash plant nearby, that yellow squash plant can pollinate the zucchini that you're growing. The fruit that develops is going to be a zucchini. It's not going to have any attributes of the yellow squash. It's going to have all the attributes of that parent zucchini plant. The seeds are what are affected by that cross-pollination. The seeds will have the joint genetics between the two types of squash. So even though the zucchini looks like a zucchini and tastes like a zucchini and is exactly what you wanted to grow in your garden, if you save and plant those seeds, the results are like rolling the dice. It might look like a zucchini and taste like a different type of squash. It might look like a different kind of squash and taste like a zucchini. It may have very little difference to the original parent. You just never really know. I've told this story before of when I was working at the Galileo Garden and I planted sun gold tomato seeds. Now, sun gold is a hybrid. It is a delicious tomato. It's a favorite of my granddaughters. But when you plant the seeds of a hybrid, you never know what you're going to get. And I did that one year. And I think I did 12 plants as an experiment. So when I took the sun gold seeds, now a sun gold tomato is a cherry tomato. It's an orange flavor. It's extremely sweet. When I took those seeds and planted them and grew plants to the point of fruiting, the fruit on the children of the sun gold, some of them were red. Some of them were very small red. Some of them were big red. Some of them were a yellowish color. None of them had that orange color of the sun gold. Some of them were very bitter tasting. Most of them had kind of a mild flavor. None of them had the sweetness of the sun gold. So the seeds grew into wonderful plants, but the resulting fruit didn't resemble the parent fruit at all. That's why in the gardening world, with those of us that have the experience will say, don't plant the hybrid seeds expecting to get anything in particular, because they're mixing all of the genetics, and you really can't predetermine the results. The professional breeders will grow hundreds or thousands of combinations of plants, just waiting to see what results. And then when they find something that actually works, then they take it even further and try to refine the characteristics of that hybrid, like a sun gold. So be aware that you can do that in your own garden. You can mix plants and plant the seeds of the hybrid fruit, and it might give you something that is surprising. I had a video last year I did on land race gardening, and that's the concept where you just let plants cross pollinate and see what results. And it may be good, maybe bad, but it's an experiment over time. And this is another thing you can do to benefit your garden through the use of genetics. If you allow some of this cross pollination, and if you only save seeds from the plants that do best in your garden, you will eventually have plants that will almost always do best in your garden. When you save the seeds from the strongest plant and the healthiest plant, you're more likely to get a plant next year that will also be strong and healthy. If you collect the seeds from a weak plant, you increase the possibility that you'll be growing weak plants in the future, because maybe that's your soil, it's your climate, it's your weather. There's something about your garden that may be stressful on plants. Well, choose the seeds that are doing the best, that aren't as impacted by that stress, and you're more likely to have some great success. Hello, Tony from Simplified Gardening says, when I was growing giant veg, I really spent time cross-pollinating by hand to ensure the genetics were what I wanted. The flowers were either netted or tied closed after I pollinated them to prevent. And then it goes on to say contamination. So absolutely, absolutely. And so this is that second part of saving seeds, and I'll actually touch on a few things that Tony has mentioned. So if you want to save the seeds for future generations of plants that do not pollinate themselves, the plants that require pollination from another plant, then you grow multiple plants of the same variety, and you do exactly what Tony's talking about. You hand pollinate. And I have a video that shows me doing this with pumpkins, where we take the pollen from a male flower and you will put it into a female flower on the same plant. And then you wrap it up so that it can't be contaminated by a different squash that's growing somewhere nearby. It takes work. That's one reason why hybrid seeds tend to be a little more expensive than the open pollinated seeds, because somebody took the time to go to all the effort to make sure that the resulting seed was pure and not contaminated. So definitely keep that in mind. An important aspect, and Tony has great success with this, is if you're trying to grow a specific type of fruit. So Tony is really trying and already has set some records in growing giant fruit. And so when you're trying to grow a giant pumpkin, for instance, you have to grow the seed from a giant pumpkin. At the Galileo Garden, I was growing giant pumpkins for the students as an experimentation to show them how this works. And we were able to grow a pumpkin that weighed more than 100 pounds. Now, the key was it was an Atlantic dill pumpkin, which was genetically developed to grow very heavy pumpkins. To grow that super fruit, you have to have the seed from other super fruit. This year, I grew the Jack B. Nimble pumpkins, which are very small pumpkins. I could water that pumpkin all day long. I could cover it with fertilizer. I could put extra lights at nighttime. I could do everything I could possibly do to try to get those small pumpkins to grow bigger, and they never will grow bigger than what the genetics call for. And the genetics call for a very small pumpkin. Howden is a pumpkin I love. It's a great pumpkin to have at Halloween. It's kind of a mid-sized pumpkin that might grow to 10 or 12 pounds. Same thing. You could baby those pumpkins all you want, and they're never going to reach 100 pounds. The pumpkin that I grew to 100 pounds, I could also have done much more to try to get it bigger. It would never have grown into a world record 2,000 pound pumpkin. You can get what you want when you choose the seed with those particular attributes. And that's really the primary message in today's show. If you want something in your garden, you must choose a variety of plant that will give that to you. So if you want big pumpkins, you've got to get big pumpkin seed. If you want delicious tasting tomatoes, you have to get delicious tasting tomato seeds. I was on Enoch's Urban Gardener show yesterday, and we were talking a little bit about this. I have a gardener friend who puts sugar around his tomatoes and teaches that as a viable technique to make your tomatoes taste sweeter. Zero science behind that. Sugar in your soil will not make your tomatoes taste any sweeter. The sweetness of your tomato is determined by the genetics of your tomato. If you take a sour, very acidic tomato, you can put all the manure you want, all the sugar you want, the water, the sun, everything you could possibly think of to try to get a sweet tomato. You'll never get a sweet tomato because what you're growing is a sour, acidic tomato. So keep that in mind as we continue with questions and as we talk more about the genetics. Choose your varieties carefully to get what it is you're looking for. I'm asked throughout the year questions about why my tomato didn't do this or why my squash didn't do that. It almost always comes down to the genetics of the plant. If you didn't choose the right variety, then don't be surprised if some difference results in your garden. It might be something that you like, but it might not be exactly what it is that you're looking for. Christine is saying, so if you can't save seeds from your gold plants to grow next year's plants, how are the seed companies able to get seeds to produce sun gold? Well, and so this gets back to that idea that you have these seed producers that have figured out what the combination is. So, and they keep it very secret. So, for example, a sun gold tomato might be a cross between a red velvet cherry tomato and an Isis yellow cherry tomato. Both of those are open pollinated. One is yellow, one is red. And maybe they determined that if they cross pollinate the red velvet with the Isis yellow, the result will be an orange tomato that tastes very sweet. So if you knew what the combination was that these plant breeders are using, you could do it at home. You could develop your own sun gold tomatoes if you knew what the parent plants were. And so that's a good question, and one to keep in mind, that we can do that. We can crossbreed our tomato plants, like Tony was saying, with the hand pollination on a squash, for instance. That's easy to do. It's big flowers. It takes a little more effort with the small flowers of a tomato to be able to take the pollen from one plant and move it to a flower of another plant, and then keep it isolated, and then grow the tomato, and then save those seeds, and then next year plant those seeds, wait till the end of the season, and then see what happens. So for those of us in a home garden, it takes 2 years for us to see the results of our labors. Whereas in a commercial setting, they're able to do this on a much faster basis, in greenhouses. They can probably get 2, if not 3 generations within a single year. And they're doing this all the time. And then when something works, they make note of it and they know which combination of plants will produce which type of fruit. And that's how you know that the sun gold seeds that you're buying to grow in your garden will produce sun gold plants, because the seed seller has already gone to all that effort to cross pollinate and grow the tomatoes and then save the seeds. So, and that holds true with all of the hybrids that you're buying the seeds for in your garden, is to uh, it is to trust the seed source. But when they say that they're producing a particular type of tomato that's resistant to disease or a different color or a different flavor, they've already taken that effort. And it may have taken years of research for them to get that result. And particularly when new uh, tomato seeds come out, a new variety, they'll often charge more for those new varieties to help recoup some of those costs, because it can take years for everything to reach the point that they finally can go to market and you can finally buy them. And then, of course, they have to wait to see if it's going to be successful, if it's a plant that people actually like and then are willing to buy year after year. So there's a lot of effort involved with that. Jan, Ron, and Arthur are saying, planted Kilimanjaro white marigolds from the nursery 10 years ago, saved seeds. Following year, I got frizzled topped white, and that's their name. 10 years later, I'm still getting surprise white marigolds yearly. Yeah, so this is another important aspect of the saving of your seeds, particularly if it's a hybrid. It takes time for the genetics to stabilize. So when we talk about the sun gold producing after they cross-pollinate the parents, they have to keep repeating that process for years to see if the genetics remain stable when they cross-pollinate two parent plants. When we discover something new, it's the same thing. It takes generations for those characteristics to stabilize. Generally, it's at least 7 generations, 7 to 10 generations. And so if you are just letting the white marigolds go to seed and spread around, you're probably going to get pretty good variety of the white marigold seeds. I think that's pretty cool. And especially this when it's a surprise white marigold that pops up. If you take the effort to take a single white marigold plant, one of these frizzles, save the seeds from that plant, then plant those seeds, and then see what results. And you'll probably get different types of frizzle flowers. Then you save the seeds from a single plant that you really like the characteristics. If you repeat that pattern over 7 to 10 generations, the genetics will usually stabilize to the point that when you save those seeds and plant them, you'll get that same white frizzle marigold that you've been planting for years by that point. And that's definitely an option. A lot of the heirloom tomatoes, for instance, a lot of the heirloom plants in general that we grow in our gardens now, that's how they started. There was some genetic mutation, some variation. The gardener saved those seeds and continued to plant those seeds, and then took the fruit that did the best, that they liked the best, and saved those seeds. And you'll end up with a variety that is stabilized over a period of generations, and you've just created a new variety. There's a great book, and I've got a link to some of my favorite books in the description below. It's Epic Tomatoes. I did a video on this a long time ago, probably 7 years ago. I think I made that video. I love the book, Epic Tomatoes. And it talks in that book about how the tomatoes were developed. And so Craig, the author of that book, actually has developed some varieties that are for sale now that you might find in your store. And that's what he did just in his home garden, was to take a variety, save it when he noticed a mutation, and then stabilize those genetics to create a whole new variety of tomato. And I've done that as well. Occasionally, you might hear someone refer to my Galileo moon tomato. I'm in the process of stabilizing the genetics on the Galileo moon because it was a mutation that happened, I think, 7 years ago now. And I save the seeds, and each year I'm saving more seeds to reach the point that I'll have a new variety that I can share seeds from. So it can be fun, and it can be one of those things that takes some effort, but if you're willing to do it, do it. If you've got extra space in your garden and you come across something like that, I think it's awesome to try. Pat, good to see you this morning. How are cold weather variations developed with okra, for example? So it's it's exactly all of this that I'm talking about, where you find a plant that does well and you save the seeds from that. And so some of it is done by forcing the plant. So a lot of these major seed producers, if they're trying to develop a cold season plant, they can actually force cold into the greenhouse and then see which plants are able to be strongest and healthiest when exposed to those cold conditions. And that's the seed they save. Or in a home garden, and this is what I was talking about earlier when I say save the seed from the plants that do best in your garden. I live in a cold region, and I never know how late spring is going to run before summer actually shows up, and I never know how early fall is going to arrive with an early frost. And so when I look at the plants that do best in my garden, I'm looking at some of those factors. How well did they survive a late frost or an early frost? And if the plant did well and survived and produced fruit, then those are the seeds that I'm saving for next year. And that's how it's done. It's through observation and sometimes by forcing it, but observing to see which plants are able to handle the cold weather. And then every subsequent year, save the seeds from the plants that do best. And then eventually you're going to have that stabilized genetic seed, and you can market it and sell it and say it's cold hardy. And that's how it's done. So thank you for that question, Pat. Thank you for that contribution. I definitely appreciate it. And hopefully that answers the question so that you can figure out maybe what you could do in your garden. Because I know we in Colorado have difficulty with the cold weather. And so peppers are a great example of this. There are a lot of varieties of peppers that I've grown that weren't marketed as cold hardy, but after a freeze or a hard frost, some of my peppers actually were still alive and continued to grow. Those are the peppers that you would save the seeds from to grow in subsequent years to help you develop a garden specific plant line that actually does well. There might just be minor genetic differences. We're not talking a completely new variety. It may still be a pepper plant that you like growing. King of the North, for instance, I think is one that is marketed as being able to handle some cool conditions. So when you grow something like King of the North, a cold hardy pepper, you would save the seed from the plant that was the hardiest. You're not creating a new variety. You're just refining that variety and getting the genetics that are within the plant already, but that can benefit your garden specifically by how you grow and which seed you're choosing. Serena's asking, mortgage lifter tomato was bred from 4 varieties, beefsteak, German Johnson, and I forget what the other 2 were, but it's an heirloom tomato now. How did it happen? It's the same way. And so the mortgage lifter goes back to the 1920s and then into the 1930s. And that's what that gardener did. He looked at what was happening in the garden and chose plants that were doing the best. The mortgage lifter had a beautiful big beefsteak tomato, and over time he stabilized the genetics. So now it is an heirloom plant because it was developed almost 100 years ago. But at the time, It was just a tomato plant that had produced a genetic mutation, and he recognized that and worked to stabilize what became the mortgage lifter tomato. And the reason, if you don't know, it's a great story. The reason it's called a mortgage lifter is because during the Great Depression, that's how he saved his house. He was able to grow that tomato, which was better than what a lot of other people were growing in their gardens. He sold the seed, made enough money to pay his mortgage, and he didn't lose his house during the Great Depression. So that's the story behind that. And whether it's myth or whether it's valid, there's obvious truth to it when you look at the basics of the story. But that's what it is. And you can do the same thing in your garden. When you grow tomatoes and you save the seed, the likelihood is that the flowers pollinated themselves. So when I save my black Krim tomato seed, I'm saving the seed from tomato plants that were growing very near to other different varieties of tomato plants, because the likelihood that those flowers have pollinated themselves is extremely high. And particularly if you're not seeing many pollinators in your garden, then the chances are very, very high that those tomatoes have pollinated themselves. But that's not always the case. Occasionally, there will be pollination from insects. Or if you take that effort to hand pollinate from different varieties, then you can develop a new variety and test it and stabilize it. And before you know it, 100 years from now, they might be talking about the tomato that you developed because you were able to take all that extra effort. Okay. And Jay is saying giant vegetable seeds are often very expensive and require a lot of specific knowledge and skill to get to record sizes. Absolutely. And so using the pumpkins again as an example, when I was growing those giant pumpkins, I actually was contacting some of these organizations. There are giant pumpkin growers associations around the world. And they're doing exactly what I'm talking about. They are cross-pollinating different pumpkins, and the record keeping is incredible. And so I bought some seeds from one of the giant pumpkin producers, and the plants did okay, but I wasn't able to give them all the conditions they needed. I did it at the school garden. They got pretty big, but the season ended too soon. They needed more time. We just got them in the ground too late. And so they didn't do that great. The tomatoes or the pumpkin seed that I bought was like variation A3649. It didn't even have a name. It was just the seed. And when we got the seed, they gave the lineage of that seed, that it had been developed by cross-pollinating a different type to another type. None of them had names. They were all numbers. But the resulting fruit, the pumpkins, did have those basic attributes of big size. So when you take an 800-pound pumpkin plant and you mix it with a 900-pound pumpkin plant, and then save those seeds and plant those seeds, you might get a pumpkin plant that produces 1,000-pound plant. And then you cross that with another, and then you cross the offspring with another. And over a period of time, after following that lineage, you can get to a point where you know that if you take the male pollen from pumpkin plant A and use it to pollinate pumpkin plant Q, that you're going to get seed that on average produces 1,500-pound pumpkins. And so every year, that's what they've got to do. You can't save the seed of the 1,500-pound pumpkin and expect that it's going to give you a 1,500-pound pumpkin. But you know that if you mix the A and the Q together, you're going to get a 1,500-pound pumpkin. And that's how they develop sun gold. That's how they develop these super massive pumpkins. This is how they develop the super hot chili peppers. It's the same thing. I've been talking about the size of the plant and the taste of the plant. Well, with the chili peppers, it's the heat of the fruit that you're developing. And so by cross pollinating different types of super hot peppers, you will produce a fruit that could reach the point like that happened with the X pepper, pepper X recently setting the world record as the hottest pepper. That's what he did, but it took him 10 years of doing that to finally reach a pepper that was able to break the world record for heat. This is something that not to take lightly. Have fun with it and save the seed and plant your hybrids. But if you're really serious about trying to develop something, we're talking about a decade of work to finally get to the point where you can say, I have developed this pepper and it is consistent and it's producing exactly what I want, which in this case is a super hot pepper. Tony is saying, same as the 131-pound zucchini I grew. It took me 6 years of selecting seed for that. So I think that's cool. And that's why I wanted to talk about it today, because this is a whole arena of gardening that many of you have probably never thought about. Growing whatever it is, for size, for taste, for heat, for color. These are all things you can do in your garden. And if you're an avid, passionate gardener and you're looking for something new to try, this could be one of those things that might make a difference in what's happening. Sherry's asking, what are your thoughts on selecting seeds for an increasingly warming climate? So same thing, that same basic answer for the cold hardy plants. You do the same thing. I, like many of us, have noticed that our summers are generally hotter and longer. And so take a look at what's happening in your garden. Look at the plants. The plants, tomatoes, for instance, there are tomatoes that don't handle heat very well. And there are tomatoes that handle heat quite well. Well, observe, see what's happening within your garden. And so when you select the seeds, if you've had one of those record setting summers like many of us have had in recent years, that's what you do. You select the seeds from the plants that are able to fight off that heat. Now, for someone like me, and that's one reason why I like black crim so much, I've got both. I've got the early frosts in fall, and I've got the extremely high heat with low humidity in summer. So I need to choose the seeds from the plants in my garden that can handle both the hot summer and the cool fall so that I can get the longest harvest possible. And when I'm saving my black crim seeds, I'm choosing the plants that are still doing well at the end of the season because they've encountered all that heat and they're showing me that they can handle the cool conditions. And by observing and saving those seeds, it's doable, whether it's cold or hot, windy, dry, humid, whatever is happening in your garden. Observe, see what's doing best, and those are the seeds that you should save moving into the future. And it's not a lot of work. If you're planning on saving seeds anyway, just add that to your decision. Choose the best seeds. If you're not saving seeds yet, I strongly encourage that you start saving seeds. And then, as part of the process, choose the seeds from the plants that are doing the best. And then you'll get hooked. You'll notice that from then on, things really tend to be wonderful because you're growing the plants that do great. So Gina's saying, if you love Cherokee Purple and haven't yet tried the Cherokee Carbon Hybrid, get some of the seeds this winter. Huge, beautiful, delicious, and very productive. I'm still getting some off the plant in December. And so Craig Lahoulier, the one I was talking about that wrote the book, Epic Tomatoes, many of these Cherokee hybrids are the ones that he developed. That's what I was talking about when I said he, in his own garden, was developing new hybrids. He's the one that pretty much made Cherokee Purple famous many years ago and has since developed different hybrids from the Cherokee Purple. And absolutely, if you like Cherokee Purple, go for it. Now, for me, Cherokee Purple doesn't do as well in my garden as the black crim. So that's why I prefer the black crim over the Cherokee purple. Cherokee purple is a great tomato, but it doesn't do as well in my garden. And so, great suggestion. Try something new, grow it in your garden. And if it's big and beautiful and delicious and productive and does well for you, then keep going. Keep growing those into the future. And that's how you have the best success, is by growing the plants you know are going to do great. So now, as we continue talking about the genetics and growing plants, I've been focusing so far on the seeds because there's so much variability with pollination, cross-pollination, self-pollination as to what the seeds will give you. Plants are unique so far because you can also grow the exact same plant. And so if you think about this, this is something that at least isn't currently allowed with animal testing, but you can grow a plant that is exactly the same plant that you are growing. And so you see all the science fiction films where someone is trying to clone themselves, usually the billionaires, and things go wrong. Great movies, and they all have the same basic theory that clones are never as good as the original, and therefore they're going to be evil or some problem with them. That may hold true in the animal world, but there's not a lot of cloning of animals that's happening right now. But there's a lot of cloning of plants that is going on. And you may be cloning your plants without even realizing it. The best example is strawberries. So a strawberry will send out those runners. So you have the mother plant, and those runners are often referred to as daughters. But really, those are just new mothers. Genetically, it's the same plant. So when you get a strawberry, and TriStar I grew this year, I love the TriStar variety. I first time grew it this year. It's still green. It's still producing in my greenhouse. I love the TriStar. Delicious. By planting those daughters, those runners, you are getting the exact same plant. And so, what the breeders will do for strawberries is they will take the flowers and they will cross pollinate different plants. And then they'll see what plant develops and what kind of fruit develops. From that point on, they're no longer cross pollinating to reach a variety that they like. So, TriStar, for instance, I grew Cavendish and it didn't do great in my garden. So let's say I was growing the Cavendish varieties, and I was also growing the Ozark Beauty, which is another variety I'm growing. And I noticed a new plant pop up someplace that the flowers had cross pollinated, and that I didn't even recognize that the seed of a fruit had fallen and a new plant pops up. And I'm assuming that it is either the Ozark Beauty or the Cavendish. Instead, what develops is a plant with bigger fruit, better tasting fruit, and a hardier plant. I don't have to know what the parents were. All I know is that strawberry has produced exactly what I want. From that point forward, all I have to do is propagate by planting the runners and get the same plant, the clone of the mother. And for every generation to follow, unless there's a genetic mutation, I'm going to get the same plant. So the TriStar, that's what I'm going to do from here on out. And I've already done it, is pot up those little runners and put them into new beds, and I'll have all the TriStar plants I could possibly want. So strawberries, when you buy a particular variety, you will continue to get that variety regardless of pollination, regardless of seeds. It's all about the cloning of the mother plant as you propagate. You'll see this with raspberries. Raspberries that will take over a garden, mint will take over the garden. All of those plants that are spread through rhizomes or roots, and then a new plant pops up, that new plant is a clone of the original plant. So when you propagate them, you still have the same plants. I started growing strawberries when I moved to Colorado 25 years ago, just over 25 years ago now. The first strawberry I grew was Quinault. I love Quinault. I grow Quinault in my garden to this day. It's the same plant as those original plants I grew 25 plus years ago. Because over the course of more than 2 decades, every time I moved to a new house, I just potted up the runners, put them into the garden, and continue that process of propagation. And so it's new strawberry plants, but it's the same strawberry plant that has developed over all of these years. And the same with my heritage raspberries. When I moved to a new house, I just dig up some of those raspberries, put them in the new garden. It's the same plant that I was growing before. So be aware of that. If you find a plant that you really like and it's one of those that propagates through runners or through the rhizomes, you are cloning it every single time you put a new plant in the ground. That's what enables you to have that stability of that variety in your garden. It's similar when we talk about most of the fruit trees that we're putting in our garden. And so when we put in that Gala apple tree, the reason we're getting Gala apple trees is because that tree is a clone of the original Gala apple. Remember, I said that all apple trees will cross pollinate. And so every apple is going to produce hybrid seed. So to get a consistent apple, like a Gala or Red Delicious, whatever it happens to be, you have to clone the tree. And the way that's done is through grafting. And this is a whole nother arena. I want to start getting into grafting more in the next couple of years. So if you take a branch from a Gala apple tree and you put that branch, you graft that branch to the trunk of a Red Delicious apple tree, the fruit that will be produced on that Gala branch is going to be Gala apples. And that's how every apple tree producer that sells you an apple tree does it. They graft the original branch to another branch and produce an apple tree. It's as simple as that. And so think about that. And as you are trying to propagate tree fruit in particular, if you want the same thing, you need to think about cloning. You need to keep the genetics the same to get the same results. The roots really don't matter. So when you buy a Gala apple tree from Fedco, I love Fedco as my source for apple trees. If you go to Fedco to buy a Gala apple tree, they'll give you an option. You can get a dwarf apple tree. So the the roots are an apple tree that grows very small, and then they graft the branch of a Gala onto that rootstock. And when the tree develops, because of the root system, it's going to be a very small tree, but the fruit is going to be Gala apples. You can get a semi-dwarf apple tree. That's what most of my trees are. And so they take a root stock that produces a smaller than average tree. They put the Gala branch grafted to that rootstock. And what develops is an apple tree that might be 12 feet tall that produces Gala apples. Or you can get a standard apple tree. Same basic thing. They take the rootstock of a full-size apple tree, they graft the branch of a Gala apple onto it, and now you get a tree that's 16 or 18 feet tall that grows Gala apples. It's all about the genetics. It's all about understanding how we can take plants and continue to grow the plants that we really want in our garden. So thank you, Jay. I was actually going to do that towards the end of the show, but I'll do it now. So last week we talked about seed catalogs, and Jay said that she was going to compile a list. She went above and beyond. So if you actually go to last week's show, and you'll see it posted as Ecology Today, that's Jay, multiple postings of all of those different seed catalogs that we were talking about last week, not just the ones that I was talking about, but all the stuff in the comments as well. So thank you so much for that, Jay. That was fantastic effort, fantastic labor to put all that together. And now it's there in the comments. I think, was it five or six different comments to get everything listed. So thank you. And I ask all of you to thank Jay as well for all of her effort to put that compilation together of everything that we talked about last week, because it really was fantastic as to the results that are now out there for everybody to refer to and to look at. And it's all because of Jay. So Jay is fantastic when all those things are considered. Okay, I know I'm behind with the comments, so I'm just going to scroll down quickly and try to get closer to real time. And I apologize if I've missed some of your comments, because we've been talking about these genetics, and it might not have, or I might have skipped over something that you might have asked 20 minutes ago, because I'm about 25 minutes behind with my comments at this point. So Julie, thank you for that. Thanks for keeping up the good content. Greetings from Europe. And greetings to you. Good evening in Europe. I'm glad you can be with us today. Concrete Jungle is saying, I like Granny Smith, Bramley, and Braeburn apples best. And so those are all clones of the original. And so occasionally you'll see a video with somebody trying to grow an apple tree and to see what develops. And so James Prigioni, I think last year, had a video where he had done that. He planted an apple seed and let it grow for a number of years, and then harvested the apples to see what happened. And he actually had pretty good results. It wasn't the same as the parent plants, but it was a viable apple. And so that's what the apple producers are doing, is they're planting the seeds from these cross-pollinated varieties, growing an apple tree, waiting until it fruits, and then seeing what fruit develops. And if it's tasty, if it's got a great color, if it travels well, if it stores well, then they have a variety that might be marketable. They can cut the branches, put it on the different rootstock, go through more years of research to see which rootstock works best with the grafting, and they've got a new variety. And so Fuji apples, I think I read recently that Fuji apple is the top selling apple in the world right now. And it's relatively new. Fuji's didn't exist a couple decades ago. And that's what happened, is an apple producer discovered this really good tasting apple after all of the experimentation, and it travels well, stores well, looks great, and sells well. Granny Smith, of course, is one of the best cooking apples out there. I've got a Granny Smith on my cutting board right now because I used Granny Smith over the Thanksgiving holidays. So yeah, there's a lot of those that tend to be our favorites, and you can thank the apple producers for going to all that work to find those combinations that give us the kind of apples that we really like. And I eat a lot of apples, so there's I'm thankful, of course, to all the producers that have spent that work to give us the ones that we really like. Okay, let's see. You guys have posted a lot of stuff in here, so I'll keep going. Yeah, Boothby Garden says, had my first Honeycrisp apple last month. So tasty. I love Honeycrisp. That's my current favorite. And so when I'm going and getting the apples that I get on a weekly basis, Honeycrisp is often the one I choose for that. So if you really want to delve into the science of genetics and propagation, you can look at cellular propagation. And so this is also a method of not mutating, of basically taking the the plant that is doing well, that has the attributes that we want, and then cloning it. And so it's easy with fruit trees because you just take a branch and you graft it, and now you have a clone. And it's easy with the brambles because they're spreading through their roots, and you just dig them up and sell the new plant. It's not as easy with the soft bodied plants, with those vegetable plants that we have, the spinaches, celery, all of those kind of plants. You can't really graft them. You can graft peppers and you can graft tomatoes, but you really can't graft spinach. So what you do instead is you take cuttings, and basically it's like a petri dish scientific experimentation that you might be familiar with from school. It's the same basic idea. They take the cells of the plant and propagate them to develop more plants, more cells that can grow into plants. And then through a process of that cellular generation and some grafting, you can develop some new varieties of plants, and you can continue experimenting on the specific plants when you find a variety that was a hybrid, but you want to continue growing it consistently. And so you don't see that a lot. I think it's done more in the commercial setting, where a commercial grower is buying plants, very small plants that are then grown in a greenhouse. That is a developing part of the industry where some of those plants might have been developed through that cellular propagation. So look into that more because it is pretty fascinating, some of the things that are happening. Now, when we talk about hybrids, when we talk about the varieties that we're choosing in the garden, when we talk about our own experiments, and even when we talk about most of what's happening at the commercial level, we're not necessarily talking about GMOs. Now, GMO, genetically modified organism, is really kind of intended to talk about those plants in particular that have been modified genetically by inserting some non-vegetative gene. And so the great example of this are those commercial crops that have the glyphosate, the Roundup gene inserted into them, so they are pest resistant. And so that's what so many people get concerned about when they get scared about GMOs. I want to tell you, don't get scared about GMOs in the home garden. With the exception of the purple tomato that came out this last year, none of what you're growing in your garden is going to be a GMO. It takes a lot of work, a lot of time, as we've been talking about, to develop the new hybrids. Now you add the expense of genetic modification, and it's just not worth it for the home grower. So these seed companies are not doing genetic modification by inserting different genes in a laboratory because it isn't necessary. All we have to do to get a new type of tomato is cross-pollinate. All we have to do to get a disease-resistant squash is to cross-pollinate and observe the response to pests. That is so much easier, so much less expensive, that's how it's done in the gardening industry. And so I get asked occasionally about GMOs and the different seeds I use and my views on GMO seeds. I don't care about GMO seeds because I'm not a commercial agriculture grower. Those industrial level farms are using GMO seeds. almost all of them nowadays. When you look at the corn, when you look at the soybeans, when you look at so much of the industrial agriculture, many of those are GMOs, but not for you, not for me. Pick any seed company that you order the seeds from. They are not selling GMO seeds. Most of them have taken the non-GMO pledge. I think that's unnecessary, but they have a pledge that says we will not sell GMO seeds. It's a marketing thing right now because there aren't any GMO seeds to sell to home growers. They're patented, they're sold in big bulk lots, and they're not being packaged and sold to the home gardener. So just be aware of that. That's one of those things that if you were at all worried about GMOs, just relax. And yeah, Sherry is exactly right. My understanding is that GMO seeds are only available to large scale farmers. And that's a key point, is they're not even available to us. You can't buy them. Now, if you know a farmer that's growing those things, and sure, that farmer might get you some of that seed, but there are so many restrictions about giving away seed and sharing seed and selling seed that you probably can't do that legally in most cases. So GMOs are just kind of a non-event when it comes to the garden. And Gardens Happen is right, is those no GMO labelers spread a lot of misinformation about GMOs. Yeah, that's why I say it's a marketing ploy. They're feeding on the fears of gardeners and selling non-GMO seed, some cases more expensively than other seeds, and it's misinformation. There really isn't any concern when you start talking about that kind of stuff. So relax. And hybrids are the same thing. There's confusion, particularly with newer gardeners. The assumption that a hybrid is a GMO seed. Well, yes, if you think about the term genetic and modification, anytime that you cross pollinate to get a new plant, yeah, you're modifying the genetics. You're taking the genetics of one plant and the genetics of another plant to produce a third plant. Yeah, farmers and gardeners have been doing that for thousands of years. That's how we get new varieties, is we modify the genetics by observing what the plant is doing and saving the seeds from those plants that give us the attributes we're looking for. Everything I've been talking about today. So in the specific terminology, we are modifying plant genetics. Every time we put a hybrid and save the seed and see what's going to happen, it's all about the genetics. Is it a GMO, that term that is usually referred to a cellular modification in a laboratory? No. So don't be afraid of hybrids either. There's some wonderful hybrid plants out there that can be wonderful for the garden. Be aware, and this really holds true when we start talking about flowers and the flowers we want to grow in our garden, that the modification of the genetics to get the flower may give you a flower that has completely different characteristics. So, for instance, the double flowers, and you'll see this, they're doing double zinnias and double roses, the blossoms that actually have like a second blossom on top of the first blossom. Beautiful, and all different colors. And all of that is by observation and cross-pollination and developing the seed that gives that particular attribute. If you are growing flowers in your garden for the purpose of encouraging pollinators, so that those pollinators will go to your apple trees and to your squash and to whatever else you're growing in the garden, be aware that many of these mutations, because that's what they are, these new varieties that have these mutations to give us something like a double blossom, many of those new varieties have lost the ability to attract pollinators. And so the new gardens with some of these new varieties really aren't as effective for benefiting the garden when it comes to the pollinators. And I think that, that's good and bad, because many of us are growing flowers because they look good. Just want you to be aware that the flowers that look good don't always serve the purpose of the flower and the pollinator. And so in my pollinator garden, the plants I grow are the old standards, the ones that have been the same for years and years, the perennials like echinacea and rudbeckia, the annuals like the cosmos and the zinnias. And it's the basic flowers, not those double blossoms, not the super duper puffy varieties, but just the basic flowers that produce the pollen and the colors that attracts the pollinators. And then those pollinators can go about the garden and help pollinate all the other plants that require pollination. And so there's so much about genetics, and there's so much about pollination that you can really get yourself into the rabbit hole looking at some of these things. Just be aware that any variety is essentially possible when you start doing this experimentation and observation, and then spend the time to get that stable genetic trait. If you want to do it, you might actually be able to develop something that works so well in your garden. By all means, I encourage sharing the seed, but you may actually have an income. And that's how some of these seed companies have developed, these family-run seed companies. Many of them just started with a couple varieties, and now they have big businesses. It's an option. And so Mike W. offers yet another part of the discussion about genetics. And so knockout roses are a perfect example. Uh, they look great. They're beautiful. There are so many colors and sizes of knockout roses that are available now, and they don't smell like roses. In developing the colors and developing the knockout rose size and how they grow, they've lost the rose aroma. And I was looking for roses at my last garden. It was difficult finding varieties of rose that actually smell like the classic rose that you want in your garden. The fragrance has been lost because so much of the focus has been shifted to how they look. And a good producer of roses that you'll buy from will describe that. They'll describe the beauty, they'll describe all the things about it, but if they don't talk about the fragrance, it probably doesn't smell like a rose. And those producers that are selling you the very fragrant roses, that's going to be number one on their description, how it smells. Just be aware of that. Just because a rose looks good does not mean that it smells like a rose. And you see this in our produce section at the supermarket. All of those tomatoes were developed to be able to load into a truck and drive hundreds of miles and then load into a warehouse and then be distributed to the stores and look pretty. The taste has been lost because they were focused on an attribute, the transportation and the storage and the appearance. And that's why your tomatoes don't taste like tomatoes when you get them from the supermarket. And so much of the fruit and so much of the other produce that we get just isn't the same. You know that. It's not the same as what you can grow at home. That's why. It's because of the breeding, the genetics in those plants, and why those were developed the way they were developed. Carlos says Gregor Mendel and his peas. Mendel was looking at crossbreeding peas back in 1865. He was studying genetics all the way back then. So Gregor Mendel is really considered the father of genetics. And Carlos is exactly right. This goes back, and he was a monk and was actually started by sketching the peas and the flowers of the peas, and then started noticing what was happening with the peas that he was growing. And he recognized that the offspring was often different than what was being grown. In some cases, the flowers were different than what was originally being grown. And he started questioning it and started doing experiments. And as a result of that, we've got the whole field of genetics. So you're exactly right. Mendel was really the beginning of genetics. And it was about that same time that animal breeding really took off, particularly dogs. Up until the mid 19th century, dogs were just dogs. But once they started understanding the concepts of genetics and breeding, the breeds of dogs since the mid 19th century has increased dramatically. The small dogs, big dogs, brown dogs, white dogs, furry dogs, fluffy dogs, and it's all the genetics, and it begins with Mendel. So that's another place you can go for some research, and I find that stuff absolutely fascinating, of course. So do that. Do some of that research, learn a little bit about the foundations of genetics, and then you can start carrying that forward into your garden as you start saving your seeds and putting the plants in the ground. It's yeah, Tony, I agree as well. It is absolutely fascinating how all of it works. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about this. Dan says, "Okay, Scott, where's your background photo?" It's right behind me. It's certainly not our current conditions in Falcon. So it actually is. So this is even in winter, I'm always looking for background photos, and I haven't gotten any background photos from you all recently. I'd love to see your winter gardens. So go ahead and send me your background photos, and I'll gladly put them in beginning next year. I'll talk about that in just a second. But no, this picture I took this morning at sunrise. And Dan, who doesn't live too far from me, knows that it's snowing right now. There's snow on the ground. And so the snow started falling shortly after I took this picture. But I woke up, looked outside, the sun was beginning to rise, and I said, "Oh, that's beautiful." And of course, all my beds uh, have been covered by mulch. And so these beds just over my shoulders have new straw and new leaves on top of them. And then the sunrise over the garden. I just had to take a picture and share it with all of you. So, yes, this is my garden this morning. And it doesn't look like it does right now because it's already covered with snow. That's Colorado for you. Is sunrise will be beautiful, but these are snow clouds that we're moving in this morning. And so if you didn't know what snow clouds look like, this is what snow clouds look like moving in to drop snow. And I was actually surprised. The snow wasn't supposed to hit until about an hour from now. And so I was getting the show set up, went to let the dogs out, and it was snowing at like 8 o'clock this morning. So quite a surprise. And thanks for asking, Dan. But that really is today's picture, at least for a brief period this morning. I love getting out in the garden. I'll talk about that in a minute as well. At sunrise and other times of the day. And thank you, Tony. It does, this is one of those things where your garden, just nature, can make the whole space look stunning. So how can you complain about being a gardener and getting out and enjoying it? So, okay, let's see. Saw someone with a question about seeds, saving seeds. Let's see if I can find what that question was. I don't, was it Joe that was asking the question? I don't see it as I'm scrolling up, but I happen to note the question as it's, oh, there it is, as it started by, how long do saved seeds really last? I've heard everything from 2 to 15 years. So I've talked about this in recent shows. I think I talked about it at length last week, and I've got a couple videos about it. It depends on how you save the seed. And so if you save your seed in a cool, dry, dark location, your seeds will last longer than if they're in a hot, humid, well lit environment. So, saving seeds in your greenhouse is not a good idea if you want the seeds to last a long time. And then it depends on the variety of the seed and the type of plant. And then it comes down to the viability of the seed. So when we talk about how long seeds last, like 2 to 15 years, and I usually use, I've used this example in the live stream recently. Onion seeds, when you look, most sources will say will last 1 year. Well, that's for full viability. So if you grow onions, and I've got a video that shows how I grew my onions and saved my seeds. If you save your onion seeds, you'll have full viability for a year. That doesn't mean that they're not going to germinate after a year. It just means that in year 2, you might get 75% germination. And in year 3, you might get 30% germination. And in year 5, you might get 5% germination. So when we talk about how long seeds last, that's really what we're talking about. How long will they remain viable for most of the seeds to germinate? Tomato seeds generally are said to last about 5 years, 5 to 7 years. I did a video where I showed my seeds. I think they were 11 years old and they germinated. I didn't get 100% germination, but most of them germinated. I did the same thing with pepper seeds. Pepper seeds are kind of in that same range of 5 to 7 years, but I've germinated pepper seeds that were 12 years old. And I forget who it was, but somebody in the chat, and when we were talking about that last week or the week before, had mentioned that they had germinated some seeds that were well over 10 years old. I forget the exact number, whether it was 12 or 15, but it depends. It depends on the type of plant, depends on how they're stored. It depends on what viability you are actually using in your definition for germination. And that's why you see so many different numbers about how long seeds can be saved. And generally, I think 3 years is a good target. Almost all seeds that we can save in our garden are good for at least 3 years. So when I talk about saving my black Krim tomato seeds, I save new seeds at least every 3 years. So the seeds that I'll be putting in my garden this year, I actually saved 2 years ago. So the seed for this year is going to be 2 years old this upcoming year. I will save the seeds from next year's crop, and those are the seeds that I'll use moving into the future. Because a whole year from now, all of the seeds that I currently have are going to be 3 years old, and I could put them in the garden as 3-year-old seeds, but I just like getting on that 3-year cycle so that every 3 years I'm basically putting in new seeds, tomatoes and peppers in particular. But the onions, for me, when I'm saving the onion seeds, that's a recurring thing. And I do that when I am saving the onion seeds every other year because the onion seeds generally don't store as well and last as long as a lot of the other seeds. Tony says, I found a box of bean seed in an old shed. The date on it meant they were 13 years old. Did a germination test and still got 60% germination. That is amazing for beans. So that's exactly it. And my video where I talk about testing germination, that's exactly what you do. And I talk about that in that video. When you find a bunch of seeds, do a germination test, see what the germination rate is, and it may be good enough. Now, at a 50 or 60% germination rate, that means you got to do twice as much seed to get the same amount of plants, but the seed's still good. So absolutely consider doing that as an option, and don't throw away seed just because it's too old, because it could be 13-year-old seed and still be viable enough for you to grow. I do want to say before I forget that next week is going to be the last show of 2024, because the week after that is going to be Christmas, and the week after that will be New Year's. And I think I mentioned last week that I wasn't going to have a show those last 2 weeks of the year. So just a heads up that next week will be the last show of 2024. So I'll definitely be here and make sure you come. And I wanted to give a shout out. I haven't seen her pop on, but Yankee Sister Homestead gave me a super chat right at the very end of the show last week. And so thanks, Diane, for that. I appreciate all your support. And I didn't see it pop up as I was signing off. So I apologize for not pointing it out back then, but I did want to point it out right now. And I just can't tell you how much your support means to me. So thank you for that. And sorry that I haven't seen you here today, but hopefully we'll see you here next week and be able to get into the last show of the year. I have some ideas. I haven't figured out exactly what the theme of the show will be, but I've got some ideas. But certainly come and we can discover what that is going to be together. And I hope you'll be here to help us end this year. It's been a good year with all these shows. I did want to end by talking about the background today, by talking about sunrises and sunsets and the garden in general, because when we talk about genetics, a scientific aspect of gardening, we talk about all the chores. I cleaned up my beds and I put in, I mended and mulched. That's work. And we're not growing anything right now, so there's no harvest. So much of that is what we focus on as gardeners. We look at those tasks. What needs to be done? How well was it done? What do we have to do next? There's always something. When we're not actively working in the garden, there's kind of that withdrawal of, now what do I do? I can't harvest. I can plan. I'm always encouraging people to do planning at this time of year, but it's not quite the same. And the idea that a garden is really only good when things are growing, I think is something that causes many gardeners to miss out on golden opportunities, quite literally golden opportunities. Look at the background behind me, not only the red colors on the clouds, but the gold colors on the clouds. Now, it was cold this morning. It was below freezing, and I walked outside with the dogs and just stood in my garden as the sun rose. And of course, took some pictures because it was just incredible. And this picture doesn't do justice to the glow in the clouds and the glow in the sky. And the garden glowed at sunrise. You can take a picture. It looks nice. It's stunning. It really is. It was nothing compared to the experience of being in the garden at sunrise. If you don't like the cold temperatures in a cold region, do it at sunset, because depending on where you live, you may have fantastic sunsets. And to be in your garden as that sun glow hits your beds and hits your plants at just the right angle, it's incredible. And it's usually only for a few seconds. And that's why you have to be out in the garden to enjoy it, to totally soak up the experience. Because as I was taking pictures, and so this was picture number 3. And so I took 6 pictures over the course of about 30 to 45 seconds. So the pictures were about 5 seconds, maybe 8 seconds apart. In that short period, less than a minute from the first picture to the last picture, did not look anything like this picture behind me. That's how critical it is to be there in the moment, because it's fleeting. The sun is rising, the clouds are moving, the conditions are changing. In that moment, however, it's magical, absolutely magical. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I garden, because it's not always sunrise and sunset. Sometimes it's the middle of the day when a flock of Canadian geese fly overhead about 20 feet off the ground. It's magical. When you look at the flower and there's that bumblebee loaded front to back, top to bottom with pollen, it's magical. So, as you look to next year, as you do your planning, as you start choosing your varieties based on the genetics that you're after, looking for specific attributes, start thinking about those kind of things. What do you want to have in your garden to help make it more magical? The tastes, the colors, the sizes, everything about the garden, we have a lot of control over because we can choose how we build the garden. We can choose the plants that go in the garden. And more importantly, we can choose how we enjoy the garden. And so I wanted to end you with that today because this was a magical sunrise, magical moment. And it's snowy and overcast. It's going to be extremely cold tonight. My forecast called for 12 degrees tonight, minus 10 Celsius. This is going to be the coldest day we've had so far, but it doesn't matter because I was out in my garden this morning enjoying everything that it was giving me. So think about that. Yankee Sister Homestead, there you are. Just saw you coming on. And hopefully you heard what I said a few minutes ago. Thank you for that super chat last week. So glad that you are here and glad all the rest of you are here. And I look forward to seeing you next week for the last show of 2024. And we'll see if we can make it something special because you all are special. And that also adds to the magic of gardening. I'll see you then. And of course, enjoy gardening.